Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm absolutely the glamorous lady assistant at the end of these two completely fact-crammed experts. So I'm basically just going to shake my tassels for 5 minutes if that's absolutely okay. Is there anyone called Linda in the house? Thank Christ for that. I have to tell you, and I'm sure Joan won't mind me telling you this, Joan being the mother of my children and my ex-wife, but here we are. You see, you can even have a disunion and be good friends across the border. So you see, it's absolutely possible. Well, I'm sure she'll be delighted for me to tell you that my absolute conversion moment to independence was in a croissanterie in the West End of Glasgow in 1983, I think. And we're sitting, I think it might have been the first croissant that her from Greening and Beef and Cold Bridge had ever eaten. Certainly it was my first, it might not have been her first, she might have been slightly classier than me. But I was a radical young Marxist at that time, oh my God, furious red. And Joan started, I think, to tell a story about how she was directly related to the King of Scotland, Kenneth MacAlpin, in 10 something something. And I went, oh for God's sake, all that Scottish nationalism. She went, look, if you don't cut out that anti-Scottish nationalist stuff, you're dumped. So I cut it out. You may have known from Joan, you don't really argue with Joan, but it's not a good idea. So that was the first, I thought, okay. And then obviously after that she gave a fantastically plausible argument as to why that's the case. But the other thing that triggered me into thinking about independence from being an absolute red was probably the 1987 general election. That would be the last time I cast a vote for the Labour Party, all the way up to the top of the hill and all the way down again, right into the midst of Thatcherism again. But it was the other thing that triggered me was a book by a guy called, I'm sure you know his name, Jim Stillers. I guess you recognise his name. He wrote a brilliant book called Scotland, A Case for Optimism. Scotland, A Case for Optimism. And it was a brilliant book. He's still a brilliant man, still as vigorous as he was 25 years ago, and even after his bereavement. In fact, on the night of his on the memorial of his bereavement from Margot, he was out campaigning on that very night. But what was brilliant about the book for a young, book-crammed intellectual, Glasgow University working class intellectual like myself, is that it joined up bits of Scotland that were not joined before. So Jim's big idea in that book was something called independence in Europe. And it's this fascinating idea that to be an independent country was not to be disconnected from the wider world, but seeking connection with the wider world. And I think I read in that book Winnie Ewing, who's a great SNP figures, phrase, it's not stop the world we want to get off, it's stop the world we want to get on. And that book got me excited about being Scottish in a way that I don't think I had been from, Coatbridge, second generation Irish immigrant, cut me ID Labour voting background. And from that moment, a lot of things marched in lockstep for me about the path towards independence. I was part of a wave of artists and writers and novelists and playwrights who, in the darkest, deepest days of Thatcherism, I don't know, maybe we had something spiked in our water or something, I don't know. But we simply presumed that we had the dignity and right to be Scots on the widest possible stage, the bands, the musicians, the artists, the filmmakers. I don't know where we got our confidence from. It's quite interesting. Maybe Thatcher was just such a monster that you just had to kind of respond. But there we are. I was part of a generation who a lot of people would come up to you as an artist from that period and say, "It's good, you're speaking about half of Scotland. Good, just keep doing what you're doing." And the whole idea that Scotland wasn't properly represented to itself wasn't just a political question, it was a cultural question as well. I mean, Elaine C. Smith talks about, a lot of people talk about actually the idea that when you saw Billy Connolly on the Parkinson show, you would think, man, it's amazing that this guy who we recognise is making Parkinson laugh. So from that period on, from the late 80s, early 90s, my personal journey towards independence sort of began. And yeah, we got to 1997 and we got to the Scottish referendum in the Scottish Parliament in 1997. And I can tell you straightforwardly, I know a guy who was in the room when Tony Blair equivocated over whether you should put the referendum in the first 6 months of the new Labour government. It's a guy called Neil Lawson, who I actually worked with down in London as a member of the Compass Group. And, Neil Lawson had to say to him, look, the pressure for self-government in Scotland is too great. Look at all the artists, look at the vigour of the anti-poll tax campaign. You know, the Scots have awoken, you're going to have to give them a referendum. And so the referendum, couldn't have been more complicated, the referendum, by the way. You get the first question was, you know, do you want a Scotland with self-governing powers? Second question was, do you want it to have tax-raising powers, yes or no? Couldn't have been more complicated. Nevertheless, strong majorities for both. So, since that moment, I think one of the most interesting things, and the reason why we're standing here talking about a possible yes vote, is that from the start of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, right up to the present, it's been a bit parallel to what the musicians and the artists were doing in the late 80s and early 90s. We have been able to see how Scots can run themselves, and not just run themselves at a basic level of competence, but run ourselves really pretty well under sort of half-assed conditions, as Joan and John is saying, with a very small amount of control over our own resources, with control over maybe less than half the policies and not control of the others. Nevertheless, we've actually, I don't know if you agree with me, we can have a discussion about it in a minute or two, but I think we've been able to see how Scots are capable, if we ever didn't think it in the past, but we were able to see it demonstrated in front of our eyes, that Scots can govern themselves well and wisely, and not just from one particular party position, but all the parties that have been involved in the Scottish Parliament, who have been in charge, have built up the confidence of the country that we can run ourselves to such a crazy degree that when the SNP actually won their majority in 2011, they were actually defending a range of policies that the previous administrations had proposed. You know, it was the Labour Party and Liberal Party administrations that said retain free personal care. It was them that had said remove tuition fees for students. So the SNP were in a position of actually defending the gains that the previous parties who had been governing the country had gained. So in a sense, 2011 was a victory for the SNP. It was actually a victory for the whole Scottish parliamentary process and for all the people that had been involved in it. Because what they had been involved in, under a proportional system, we get a chance to vote on a preference of parties, is they had been involved in representing the will of the Scottish people to themselves as best they could under the limited conditions of devolution.
Here, here.
Now, and I say that, and I'm saying this, I'll tell you who I am saying this. I'm saying this with a guy who on the back of his iPad has got a Labour for Independence sticker. Alright? Because I think one of the most important things to realise, I'm not in any party at the moment. I would quite like to vote for what used to be called a Democratic Socialist Party when it comes to the 2016 election, the first election after the yes vote. I'd quite like to vote for a party. Maybe it'll be called Labour, maybe it'll be called something different. But I think the point of the yes vote coming up in 4 years' time is that it almost gets us to the starting point of Scottish politics proper. It gets us to the starting point where people can look at each other across a room, across a meeting room, across a parliamentary floor, whatever political spectrum they are, and say, do you know what? See as Democrats, see as citizens, see as voters, see as people who are in a country and identify with a country, we finally have the tools to use our resources to take ourselves forward. Our conversations now matter 100%, not 20%, not 30%, not 40%, but the conversations in Scotland about the future of the country now matter 100% because we have the control over our resources to make them matter. Now that's a profound shift. It's, as both my colleagues would say, it's not an unimaginable shift, you know? It's not as if we don't live in a world where we can look to small countries in Europe or elsewhere that are doing extremely well with less resources than us. The point has been well made, but I'm sure you noticed I think it was actually on the cover of the Daily Record actually, a picture of the Cameron cabinet coming up to visit Aberdeen. Does anyone remember that story? Cameron cabinet came up to visit Aberdeen and they were sitting, I think, in the security defended boardroom of an oil company. I think the Scottish Cabinet was down the road in a church hall taking questions from the floor, a bit of a difference there. But when the phrase that came out from that top level corporate board meeting in the oil company with the Westminster Cabinet was that Scotland needed the broad shoulders of the UK to develop the oil industry further. Now, if you were a big lad with a big left arm, you could chuck a stone that way and it would eventually land in Oslo, in a country called Norway, which managed to discover oil at the same time as the UK discovered oil in the late 70s. And without the broad shoulders of a bigger neighbour, managed to build up a £500 billion sovereign wealth fund as a result of them managing the oil sector extremely well. And not just managing the resources, but building an industry that they then export around the world, helping people to solve their energy problems. In that same time, that cabinet, as a result of the Westminster process, over the same period as the Norwegians have built up a £500 billion wealth fund that stands behind every single of the 5 million Norwegians at the same time, we've £1.5 trillion worth of debt over the same period, over the same natural resource. It is an absolute scandal. I'll give you another scandal, because I'm a great reader, I sort of read for independence. There's a brilliant book, a guy called Stephen Maxwell. I really would recommend that you get two of his the late Stephen Maxwell, a great intellectual for the independence movement. And he wrote a book called Arguments for Independence, and an even better book actually called The Case for Left-Wing Nationalism. And it's a collection of his writings from about 1974, 1975, when the whole nationalist movement kicked up and kicked into life again from after the discovery of oil. And there's a bit in it where he talks about the forgotten fifth of Scotland. This is 1974, 1975. The forgotten fifth of Scots who live on or below the poverty line. 1976, 1975. And they're still here. That's outrageous. It's an absolute scandal. When you think about the international comparisons, when you think about how aggressive Thatcherism was, and one of the things that's most aggressive about Thatcherism, which Scots did not vote for year after year after year, is that it attacked the very same manufacturing processes, the very same industries that countries who could control themselves in the continent and in Scandinavia were building up, where the workers were involved in shaping the nature of the industries, of bringing in new technology, of managing change, of growing the productive economy. At the same time, what was happening to us under Thatcherism, a largely southeastern English phenomenon, we were getting the guts kicked out of us, and Scottish productive manufacturing capacity was getting the guts kicked out of it. But as both of my colleagues have said, we are an incredibly lucky country. Not only do we have the next 30 years of oil and gas, but we also have a renewable revolution on our doorsteps. We have embarrassingly large renewable energy resources, whether it's tidal, whether it's wind, whether it's hydro. And so again, we have the ball at our feet, ready to kick in the goal, and the leg has got a yes on the boot. That's what we have to do. There's not much more that I want to say really. I mean, other than I try to sort of dig deep these days to try to ask myself why I get involved in independence and why independence is a good idea. But I think one of the great things about this campaign is that it's gone out of control. Basically, I'm a member of the Yes Scotland board, and we don't know what people are sticking the Yes Scotland sticker on of a day or of a night or of an evening, and that's fantastic. So Scotland has kind of come alive in a way that maybe some say not since the poll tax, maybe not since the glory days of Scotland in the 20s and 30s. And we can't go back to sleep again. And one of the ways I think is guaranteed that we go back to sleep again is if it's a no vote. I disagree with quite a few of my comrades in the independence movement where they say everybody's so up for it and everybody's so excited, everybody gets so engaged that no matter whether it's a yes or no, change will happen. No. I really disagree with that. If the Westminster system had wanted to change at this referendum, they could have done what they did in 1997. They could have agreed to a referendum that would have been just like the 1997 one, and it would have gone like this. Do you want more powers for Scotland? Yes or no? Yes. Second question. Do you want independence or do you want Devo Max? Yes or no? What would have won? Probably Devo Max. But they didn't want a victory. The Labour Party didn't want a victory that it could take to a 2015 general election. That was the easiest win that any party in the UK could ever have, was to construct a referendum to get Scots to vote for more powers rather than independence. They didn't want that. They wanted to kill the constitutional question stone dead. No means no or reverse. They want to shut up the whole process of Scotland arguing for more powers for a generation. So if you vote no, be aware of what you're voting for. It's not just the status quo, it's actually a reverse. They want to shut up the whole process of Scots asking for more powers. And I spent a lot of time in England. I'm a touring musician. I spent a lot of time touring the north of England, the south of England, the east and the west. Believe this to be the case, that there's a lot of people looking for a yes vote throughout the rest of the island. The polls will tell you one thing. I can tell you from people who are coming up and talking to me at hue and cry gigs and music gigs, they are saying, make a change, strike out for an ideal, show us a better way. Show us a better way. We need, as Jim Sellers said 30 years ago in his book, we need a case for optimism on these islands. And I think if you get a yes vote, it won't just change for Scotland. We won't just be in charge of our own resources in this rich country. We won't just be able to address the forgotten fifth. And if there's any test that I would put to an independent Scotland in 2006, in fact, to the second Parliament of an independent Scotland in 2021, is that we have to radically narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. I don't care who does it, I don't care what coalition of parties does it, but it's an absolute scandal that forgotten fifth exists over years of oil for 30, 40 years. Absolutely, so that's a test. But a yes vote will help the rest of the island too. I think the north of England will rise. I think it's been given the chance to govern itself quite a few times over the last 20 odd years and hasn't taken it. But I think they'll finally realise that they have to counterbalance themselves against London. And I think a yes vote will trigger that. There's a lot of people in the north waiting for that to happen. They're waiting. The whole of the island, the progressive forces in the whole of the island are waiting for the change that we can bring with this yes vote. So it's the biggest moment in my life, as you might imagine, because I'm a political, cultural anorak. But I think it's also the biggest moment in yours. Yeah. And I can only repeat, and I can only repeat what Joan and Mai's mentor, Jim Sellers, has been saying recently with his book. A brilliant book called The In Place of Fear 2. Thoroughly recommend, if you're going to join me in reading for Scotland, you read this book. It's small and it's brilliant. But he makes the point, you've heard it a million times, so I'll just finish by repeating it again. Between the hours of 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock on September the 18th of this year, you walk up to a booth, you look at a piece of paper and a pencil on a piece of plywood, and there is the power of Scotland in your hands. Between the hours of 7 and 10, you have the destiny of your country in your hands. You can decide to take power, or you can decide to let it go. What will you honestly do? What will you do when you look at your bathroom mirror that morning, when you do your chores, when you go to your work, you go to your lunch, and you think about the moment of voting yes? Are you genuinely, with all the sophistication, the resource, the history, the international comparisons, the parallels, the prospects, are you genuinely, and if anybody you know, trying to convince them, are they genuinely going to say, no, I don't want any more power, no, I'm going to let it go? I really don't believe that's going to happen. It's going to be a narrow victory, or it's going to be a thumper. So let's make sure it's going to be a thumper. Thank you very much for listening.